All right, guys, it's time for the fourth P of podcasting, and that is promote. You guys have worked so hard in creating your podcast. You've got some content now, and it's time to share your podcast with the world. You have your podcast host provider, so that's where you get your RSS feed, which leads us to today's video. And that is sharing your podcast through podcast distribution websites and apps. Now, the good news is that most of this is free. You can do some additional paid promotion, but for the most part, it is free to create accounts and to share your RSS feed on these different websites. Depending on who your podcast host provider is, they may offer you the ability to directly publish through your podcast host provider to these sites. So in other words, you wouldn't have to go to the individual sites and sometimes create an account, the very least submit some sort of application process in order for your RSS feed and therefore your podcast to be available on these sites. That can be a little bit of a process. So some podcast host providers now allow you to do that directly through their platform. There's pros and cons to this. I think you know the pro. The pro is, well, that saved me some time. I don't have to go to the individual sites and, submit independently. But here's the thing, and I kind of had to learn this the hard way. Sometimes podcast host providers will create separate RSS feeds for those different podcast sites, right? Where people are listening to podcasts. So if you ever decide to leave that podcast host provider and go to a different provider, it's not as easy as just redirecting one RSS feed. You've got to redirect a bunch, and that can be time consuming. Again, had to learn that the hard way when I transferred from one podcast host provider to another. So I always recommend people to not go through and do distribution through their podcast host provider. I recommend that you set things up yourself so that you have more control, and when you want to change your RSS feed, you can do that really quickly. So you're kind of preparing for the future, because a lot of people do change podcast host providers, and that's my personal experience just having gone through it myself. To make this process more simple for you, I have a document that breaks down the various podcast distribution sites and the links and everything that you would need to do in order to set that up independently. I know it sounds like a lot of work. It's really not, because there's only like 5 or 6 sites that you need to submit to. In fact, let's go ahead and go through that right now. There are certain places where people go to online to get their podcasts. The 800-pound gorilla is Apple Podcasts, and rightfully so, because podcasting was Steve Jobs' idea, right? He wanted some sort of media platform that would always be free and that there wasn't a large barrier to entry. And that's what podcasting is. So we have Apple Podcasts. Everything else follows under Apple Podcasts. If Apple wants to change something, then everyone else kind of has to go along with it because it's Apple, right? I would say that at least 80, maybe 75 to 80% of all podcast listening is still done through some sort of Apple device. So they have the rights, right, to be able to kind of set the standard in this industry. So we have Apple Podcasts, then the next most popular is Spotify, and it is growing in popularity. It's not super huge. I would say it maybe has 13 or so percent, 10 to 13% of the market share, but it's the next most popular. Then you have everybody else. So if this seems really daunting to you, just know you have to be on Apple Podcasts. If you want to submit to another site, submit to Spotify. It really does depend on your topic, because if your audience isn't on Spotify, let's say that you have an older audience, well, Spotify is really catered to more of a younger population and demographic, so maybe you don't want to be on Spotify. But those are the 2 big ones. Some other ones, and by the way, this is all on your My Podcast plan. That's what I keep looking at here. So I have different little check boxes so you can go through and know which sites you've applied to. We have Apple, we have Spotify, then we've got Google Podcasts, we have Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So those are the main ones. You may also want to add like YouTube or some other sites like that, and that's why I have space for you to submit to other sites as well. By the way, quick point on YouTube. It's really not worth your time to take an audio podcast and pretty much just upload it to YouTube so your audio podcast is also on YouTube. You can do it. There are third-party services out there that will convert it for you and put like an image in the background and, some squiggly lines or perhaps some words or whatever. I don't recommend you do that. I have done that. And my theory behind it when I tried it was, well, even if people aren't listening, even if they're not downloading or, watching these videos, perhaps it would help me for search engine optimization, knowing that outside of Google, YouTube is the second most popular search engine out there. So I thought if my titles had keywords in it, it would provide some sort of boost. Honestly, it didn't. It really didn't. And there are whole providers that just focus on converting your audio podcast into video to put on YouTube. And I'm here to tell you, don't do it. Don't do it. I mean, think about it. When you're on YouTube, are you going to be happy seeing an audio podcast that has a thumbnail on it? Is that really why you're going to YouTube? No. And your audience is going to feel the same way. So it's really not worth it. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your money. But there might be another site that you want to publish to, and that's why I gave you that space there. So you may be looking at this thinking, Sunny, I just heard a podcast the other day and it didn't come from any of these sites. And that's true. There are a ton of different places where you can listen to podcasts. Most of them are apps, but here's the trick. Most of them are pulling from Apple Podcasts because it's not a crime to take someone's RSS feed and put it on your site. Doesn't matter what site it is. I have a website. I could put your RSS feed on my website and I'm not breaking any rules. How is that possible? Because your episodes are contained within your RSS feed and you still get credit if someone accesses your podcast through that RSS feed. Your podcast host provider is tracking all that information. In fact, I would say you should want your podcast to be in as many places as possible. What's most important is that people are consuming the information. They're connecting with you. You're building a relationship with them. Do you really care where that happens? So just know that literally anyone can take your RSS feed and put it on their website, including these podcast apps. So there's a million different places where people can access it. Most of those apps are pulling from Apple Podcasts. Google might be the one exception, and that's because they're really using an SEO strategy because they're Google. There are a couple podcasting apps where you can pay to promote your podcast. So if you're interested in doing that, some podcasts have success, sometimes you don't. I think the benefit of doing something like that is you're already catching people where they're listening to podcasts. Because I personally have placed paid ads for Google and different places like that. And the conversion is not strong at all because people may not be, really in that frame of mind to consume a podcast. And when they are, they totally forgot about the ad. So there is some value in having your podcast promoted alongside a bunch of other shows that people are trying to access. So I'll include some information about that for you if you're interested in some paid advertising. How else can you get some free promotion? Well, these different sites will sometimes choose to feature podcasts. Apple Podcasts really started this because, again, they started the whole podcasting craze. And so they have different things. They have a new and noteworthy section. You can be featured within your category. And there is a way to go about to apply to be featured. I will say, again, I've been podcasting a long time. I used to know the exact contact to reach out to for Apple. I could talk to them personally and they'd promote my stuff right away. That was years ago. Now we have 1 million podcasts in Apple Podcasts. And just think about how much these people are being inundated with requests to be featured. So please, I encourage you to submit, but don't be upset if you don't get picked. So those are some options for you guys if you're interested in pushing your podcast out through the podcast distribution websites and apps. Again, I highly encourage you at the very least, submit to Apple Podcasts and maybe Spotify. The other ones aren't as important, but put it out there as many places as you possibly can. You never know who might listen.